Hello, I'm Julie Codell, and I'm going to give my paper, Colonial Spaces, Aristocratic Places, Country House Hospitality. In two series in the 1880s, the Magazine of Art visually endorsed a relationship by contiguity between two entities, colonial landscape space in the white colonies and privileged English places and country houses, a kind of para-heritage industry series. Through issues of perspective, boundaries, filled or empty spaces, scale, and the material page, the magazine's two series proposed to determine where culture resided, who controlled nature, and the hospitality of these two extreme domestic spheres to entice Britons to visit both of them. Pairing colonial space and English aristocratic place through specifics of habitability, imperial and national inscriptions, the magazine presented aristocratic country houses as an hospitable national heritage for everyone, and so-called wild colonial landscape as tamed and thus hospitable also, offering these sites to the general public for consumption, travel, and sociability. The magazine could deploy its cultural authority to stabilize these places' dynamic social relations and erase their class and colonial histories by invoking aesthetic principles. Vast colonial landscapes, the sublime aesthetic of nature's power that symbolized domination of nature, including domination of indigenous peoples, and country houses, the picturesque aesthetic of quaint accessibility, whose prolific objet d'art symbolized accumulated English culture. Jacques Derrida described the guest identity as informed by hospitality's collusion with power. Hospitality, he wrote, was, quote, a general name for all our relations to the other, reinvented at every second, transforming the private home into a public space. I risk opening my home to the stranger, to the absolutely unknown, and, end quote, and potentially dangerous. Yet every society has some concept of hospitality as a welcome without reserve and without calculation. Theorist Doreen Massey notes that space and place, having multiple definitions and permeable boundaries, are constructed by and construct in turn unstable, changing social relations. Space and time are intertwined in a joined dynamic. I argued that the Magazine of Art's pages attempt to stabilize and link these two sites' historical and social relationships as an imagined national community. These virtual spaces redefined and idealized social relations, ranging from the colonial there and country house here to erase negative features as colonial deportations and prisons in Australia, depleted British land values and ejected rural workers in the UK, to produce instead a spatial imaginary that promised to resuscitate a lost Britain through the magazine's cultural authority. Massey and Ernesto Laclau note inherent dislocations of fractured and paradoxical spaces. The magazine proposed to erase fractures and paradoxes through a master narrative, given that simultaneity is relative, dependent on the choice of a frame or reference in motion, and that's from Massey. In this nostalgic nationalistic framing and juxtaposing of two very different places, one historically past, country houses, one present and future, colonies, there is a modernity. For Anthony Gliddens, a consequence of modernity is the intersection of space and place. In modernity, quote, he says, locales are thoroughly penetrated by and shaped in terms of social influences quite distant from them. But the magazine, end quote, but the magazine's link dates back to East India Company 18th century nabobs, returning home to purchase country estates from impoverished aristocrats and claim their own invented aristocratic status, rooted in their time in India, where they amassed ill-gotten gain, subsequently erased from memory, replaced by illusions of aristocratic lineage embodied in the country houses they purchased. India and Britain were linked in India, but then decoupled in Britain as country houses erased the nabob's East India Company misbehavior. Reinventing these links to construct an imaginary reunification, the magazine ignored the historical struggles of both sites through its aestheticization by re-representing these sites as obverse sides of the nation, bolstered by the seemingly disinterested perspectives of nation and culture. Such strategies indicate the power of the popular art press to construct close ties between art, nationalism, and imperialist ideologies. I focus on the representation of country houses, which is serialized in the magazine with many reproductions. Privileging home splendor, the magazine did a series on successful artist studios' homes as well. Artists shown in huge studios surrounded by tasteful furniture, their works and the artist arrayed in gentlemanly posture here. In a series in the 1880s on country houses, aristocratic ownership represented British history. The magazine also focused on homes, on interior decoration and English rural structure. Through issues of perspective, boundaries, filled or empty spaces, scale, and the material page, these series proposed to determine where culture and history resided through domestic habitation that constructed national identity. Images of country houses could be ideologized through the magazine's illusion of presumed aesthetic neutrality that could disguise historical and national subtexts of these places and thus appear to stabilize these places' dynamic social relations, while erasing their classed histories and picturesque interiors filled with objet art here symbolize accumulated English culture. But as Deborah Cohen argues in Household Gods, the 1880s Magazine of Art series, Treasure Houses of Art, focused on decor over art collections, emphasizing the superb softness of the carpets mentioned in 1879, for example. Similar series appeared in the Art Journal and The Artist, two other art magazines. This magazine of Art, ran another series, How to Decorate a Room by Louis Day, an arts and crafts practitioner. Decoration information was designed to present beauty within reach of the middle class and even the working class, as in pages later of inexpensive magazine Happy Home, as Cohen points out. However, these articles in the Magazine of Art on the country house did not serve these same functions. It was a space in which authors could imagine an English history that contrasted with what was deemed dull Victorian housing and middle-class taste that needed educating. Authors amassed historical information about the sheer space of these mansions and their imagined guests and social events. Many authors gave overwhelming specifications, as if writing for architects and designers. Of Sion House, quote, each side of the quadrant court measures about 80 feet. The entrance hall is 66 feet, its breadth and height being 31 feet and 34 feet respectively, end quote. The so-called excessive gorgeousness of the vestibule enhances its 34 feet 6 inches by 30 feet and 21 feet high, end quote. Hardwicke Hall has stately proportions, it says, and is a, quote, parallelogram with 6 square towers, each 100 feet high, end quote. The dining room is spacious, lavishly decorated. The stateroom or presence chamber is 65 feet long by 31 feet wide and 26 inches high, independent of a recess 21 by 18 feet in which stand a sumptuous state bed with velvet canopy and ostrich plumes, end quote. The picture gallery's 18 windows have 27,000 small diamond-shaped panes. The picture gallery's, quote, proportions should furnish an inspiring study, 170 feet in length, 23 feet wide, and 26 feet high, with 18 windows, each 20 feet high, set in recesses 20 feet square, and walls have 168 pictures, mostly portraits, end quote. Not to mention any ordinary reader could imitate. Hardwicke Hall in Derby also embodied English history. It is among the, quote, noblest of the Derbyshire houses, also, quote, rich in architectural beauty, opulent in works of art, absorbing in historic interest, and set in Robin Hood's forest. Ancient, this is again a quote, ancient it is not decayed. It bequeaths to the Victorian era the vitality of the Elizabethan age, the home of a statesman worth at once by his noble ancestry and national service of the powerful Tudor queen and the present empress, meaning Victoria, of course, end quote. The essay focuses in this way, connecting the Elizabethans and the Victorians historically. The essay focuses on Elizabeth Hardwicke, beloved of her namesake queen, and like the queen, quote, masculine, fond of power, end quote. Tyrannical, but 4 times married, unlike the queen, Queen Elizabeth. Her propensity to rebuild the structure became the center of a grandeur for the reader. Quote, you can people the deserted rooms with the visionary company of the fair women and brave men she entertained within these walls. Here is the historic armchair, more treasured than many thrones, removed from the village inn at Whittington, in which William IV, Earl of Devonshire, sat when he and his friends hatched the conspiracy to bring about the downfall of James II, end quote, along with a statue of Mary, Queen of Scots. The author of this article proceeds to describe in detail the many works of art, claiming that Mary, Queen of Scots, left needlework there, although it's debatable if she was ever there. The author, Edward Bradbury, speculates that if the portraits were to come alive, quote, with the rustle of silk and brocade and damask, they would fill the gallery with a galaxy of rank and beauty, a company of sovereigns and statesmen, of patriots and intriguers, of despots and their victims, such as never can hold court together again, end quote. Such dark intrigue is celebrated in good sensationalist new journalism fashion as Hardwicke Hall and English history become united. Emphases on history and spaciousness are not there to encourage readers to emulate these places, but to emphasize the disparity between a country house space and readers' own less than sumptuous homes. Along with the detailed descriptions of the lush furnishings, the repetition of words like sumptuous and rich retain a distance between manor house and Victorian domestic sites. Spaciousness, not just space, becomes an imaginary historical place. Ruined castles, mansions with hundreds of years of history, the antithesis of homes served by decoration advice. Readers are repeatedly told that country house owners had impeccable taste, redecorated regularly, added rooms and spaces willfully, and were surrounded by acres of countryside as well groomed and grand as the houses. Wilton House, the family residence of the Earls of Pembroke, a magnificent abode, it's called, contained, quote, the most illustrious in history, statesmen, princes, poets, painters, and men of letters, including Shakespeare, Sidney, George Herbert Spencer, and several monarchs, end quote. Elizabethan architecture, exemplified in Hatfield House, is described as, quote, the perfection of English domestic architecture. The admiration of the descendants of the sturdy Englishmen who, when they began to be conscious that empire and intellect were alike theirs, sought to build houses which should reflect the strength of arm and the grace of mind, which combined to make the glory of England under the Virgin Queen, end quote. The author asks rhetorically, quote, how far our expanding national aspirations were reflected in the long and lofty Elizabethan gallery, and how far this splendid development of the decorative arts was the result of the increased refinement and elegance which were born of the riches of adventure and the independence of dominion in the spacious times of Elizabeth, end quote, exemplified in Hatfield House. Aligned with history, traditions, and good taste, the country house is a utopia lost but remaining, a utopia that can be visited and by contrast calibrates contemporary everyday Victorian life as small, modest, outside historical time, and only timely, not timeless. For Derrida, quote, to be hospitable, one must have the power to host. Hospitality hence makes claims to property ownership, and it also partakes in the desire to establish a form of self-identity. If the guests take over a house through force, then the host is no longer being hospitable. To behave hospitably is also always partly betrothed to the keeping of guests under control, to the dosing of boundaries, to nationalism, end quote. The country house then can and has hosted the greats of English history, contrasting dramatically with middle-class homes, a contrast with implications for national identity and for the classed and gendered figures who are designated maintainers of good taste. Touting the taste of aristocratic women and men in the country house histories that embody British history in all its glory, the country house is a stable, fixed place and the very definition of heritage. The plethora of books and articles on interior decoration define the middle-class home, unlike the country houses, as a space, unstable, subject to change, ever-changing, and subject to fashion. This aesthetic debate, the perfect taste of the aristocratic past versus the fluctuating middle-class taste that requires constant decoration and advice, is of course a politics of history represented through an aesthetic discourse that promises absolute rules in the past in opposition to constant fluctuation in the present. Time, too, is a coordinate of place and space. The past is utopianized, its social relations erased, and the country house and its vast lands are unified into an imagined England free of class struggles and of workers, full of a healthy female agency spent on restoring and decorating these mansions, a rural world in which workers and agricultural economics are utterly absent. The term stately home, sometimes synonymous with country house, was first used in a poem by Felicia Hemans, The Homes of England, published in Blackwood's Magazine in 1827, in which Hemans glorified these houses, but also linked them to cottages and rural huts, altogether embodying England. In the pages of the magazine of art, Elizabethan England and Victorian England are both distant and interpenetrating. This distance is overt and intentional, participating in the late century appeal to nostalgia for an invented 16th century orderly social hierarchy engaged in maintaining beautiful homes and grounds miraculously without visible labor other than redecorating by proxy. This distance is structured by descriptions of mansion spaces and geometry, by reproduced views of space slightly from below or into a doorway to emphasize the experience of entering such vast iconic spaces from a panoptical view, as we see here looking into Science Gallery, used for other spaces as well. Elizabethan country houses were the first architect-designed houses, and country business was transacted in these country houses. They were sites of political power as well as economic power, as places of employment for rural communities. Until the agricultural depressions of the 1870s, the estates of country houses provided their owners with income. By 1880, some financially struggling owners relied on funds from other sources such as banking and trade, while some sought to marry American heiresses or sell off their art collections. Country house activities of agriculture, county politics, and labor were full of contention and failure, all conveniently erased in the magazine's emphasis on country houses as spacious embodiments of aristocratic taste in art and architecture before the modern swan song of the English country house lifestyle was worn down by World War I, but now revived in Downton Abbey. Thank you.